It gives control of the internet over to the UN, basically. This is dictatorship by shadowy boards. And, yeah, the Republicans are talking about handing that to him when he's just been given a mandate to do nothing.
Well, we shouldn't let him do it. We should kick up a fuss, and I'm sorry we've got to, well, now listen, Alex, you know the big fight is within the Republican Party.
Oh, yes.
It's between the establishment, the people who like to think they're the kingmakers of our land, and the grassroots. And that's why people need to read my new book, A Choice Not an Echo, because that tells you about all the shady deals and shenanigans that they pulled in the past to give us this series of losers. We used to call them Me Too candidates. Whatever the Democrats said, the Republican candidate would say Me Too.
That's right, and it's an updated and expanded 50th anniversary issue.
It brings it up to date.
Tell us about the book before we go to break.
Well, the original book I published in 1964, and of course I couldn't get any publishers, so I did it myself, and sold 3 million copies out of my garage. And that is what created the conservative movement, because it told people that we had a real conservative to support, Barry Goldwater, and we could do it. And we did nominate him in the convention despite everything. And then, of course, the big boys smashed him in the general election. But we got our reward a few years later when we elected Ronald Reagan. And if we hadn't created the conservative movement with The Choice Not an Echo in 1964, we wouldn't have gotten Ronald Reagan as the greatest president of the 20th century in 1980.
Phyllis, stay there. This is so important, folks. What one lady did with a book, changing history, you could change history too. Stay with us.
We're on the march. The empire's on the run. Alex Jones and the GCN Radio Network.
The Trilateralist Commission is international and is intended to be the vehicle for the multinational consolidation of the commercial and banking interest by seizing control of the political government of the United States. The Trilateralist Commission represents a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the four centers of power: political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical. They've got most of the churches. They've got things by the Federal Reserve. They've got the Democratic Party and most of the Republicans. They've taken control of the universities. That's from his book, from U.S. Senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater, with no apologies. And I know folks that knew Barry Goldwater, just, and of course, Phyllis Schlafly knew him well. What a great guy. How wonderful it would have been to have him as president. Reagan had great rhetoric about how, you know, you did build your business and freedom's great and everything else. Politics got away from him in the Congress, and some bad things happened. Some things I disagree with under Reagan, and Ron Paul criticized those as well. But compare Ronald Reagan to Obama, who says you didn't build your business, and Hillary came out and said businesses don't hire people. There's a war against reality. We're going to talk to her and walk through this new edition of her book because it's very exciting, and I want to hear some of these stories. Then we're going to open the phones up for your quick question or comment, whether you agree, disagree, whatever, for Phyllis Schlafly. The toll-free number to join us on this live Monday edition is 800-259-9231. 800-259-9231. Questions or comments for Phyllis Schlafly. Again, I'm your host, Alex Jones. Before we go any further, we've got a whole bunch of new shirts made in America. The fabric, they're printed in America, everything, the cotton's grown in America, have come in at made-in1776.com. Now, I'm wearing right now one of the first that came out last year when we launched the Made-in-1776 line. But this is the Join or Die shirt, one of my favorites. But we've got some of the new ones in the camo, Molon Labe, and others. And we've got the 50 caliber 1776 bottle breachers that just won Shark Tank last week. We're going to get those one of those Navy SEALs that owns the company on in the next few days. And the point is, we know stuff that's interesting. We've got some new belt buckles coming in that are Molon Labe that'll sell out quickly, that are made in America. And all of this funds the InfoWars operation. We're not like MSNBC. They got stimulus money, or NPR, that gets $400 million of taxpayer money every year. We are funded by folks buying the great products at InfoWarsStore.com or Made-in1776.com, or the great supplements at InfoWarsLife.com. Now, InfoWarsStore.com takes you to directory of all those sites and shopping carts. It's basically like a whole shopping center right there. But when you buy the products from us, it funds the operation. You're shopping with the good guys. On top of it, the proprietary supplements like DNA Force, Survival Shield, X2, Oxy Powder, all of it is proprietary to the site and to our developer, Dr. Group. And you've heard the incredible reviews out there. So InfoWarsLife.com. And here's the good news. The products are very popular. Here's the bad news. We are about to sell out of Survival Shield. We are about to sell out of Lung Cleanse. We are about to sell out of DNA Force, Oxy Powder, Super Male Vitality, basically everything. Right as more colloidal silver is set to come in next week, and right as one of our new products is set to come in next week. We actually have some of it in, but not enough to even offer it. So if you want any of these products, InfoWarsLife.com. Also recommend the great longevity line of products discounted at InfoWarsHealth.com. The Beyond Tangy Tangerine, the Pollen Burst, just the Alex Pack, all of it at InfoWarsHealth.com. You can find links there at InfoWarsStore.com as well, or 888-253-3139. You can call, ask about any specials, and our great crew will answer your questions. I want to thank you all for your support. Going back to Phyllis Schlafly, of course, of the Eagle Forum. Phyllis, talk about some of the history. Talk about Barry Goldwater. Talk about the new edition of your book and why it's so important for people to get it.
Well, when I brought out A Choice Not an Echo, it had this enormous sale. And what it did was to inspire people to believe that the grassroots could win against the establishment and nominate a real conservative. Now, let me remind you that in that time period, presidents were supposed to come from New York, Pennsylvania, or Ohio. And Barry Goldwater was from Arizona. I didn't know anybody who had ever been to Arizona. There was no baseball team that was farther west or south than St. Louis. It was so far away and so distant, and yet we picked him, and we made speeches all over the country for him, and we did get him nominated. Of course, they clobbered him in the election, but we stayed together as the grassroots conservative. And then came Ronald Reagan, and we got him elected, and he had 2 wonderful presidencies. Not perfect, but certainly better than anything the Democrats had to offer. And then they kind of disintegrated after that, and we had people who pretended to be conservatives who really weren't. And we've got to revive them. And that's why I come out with my 50th anniversary edition of A Choice Not an Echo. Now, it's not a rewrite of the original. The original's in there just as I wrote it in '64. But what I do is to bring it up to date with the shenanigans and the behind-the-closed-door deals that were made in all the Republican National Conventions after 1964. Brings it right up to date. And I'm telling listeners, you can't be a player in the presidential election next year unless you know the history, unless you know what's in the past. Because we want to pick somebody who's picked by the grassroots. We don't want somebody who wants to bring in all this cheap labor and export our good jobs abroad to cheap labor countries. And so it's a big challenge, but you need to know the history in order to get going in the battle.
I agree. Phyllis, the founder of the Eagle Forum, Phyllis Schlafly, is our guest. I want to bring up some inside baseball stories here. I've been told by high-level folks that at the nomination process for the 1980 election, and I've seen the speeches and seen video clips where Ronald Reagan was criticizing George Herbert Walker Bush and saying he's a trilateralist, he's a globalist, basically going with a Barry Goldwater line of reality. And then he was taken behind closed doors and said, we're not going to back you if you don't put Bush in here, who was a Rockefeller East Coast Republican. And then you have the Clinton dynasty and the Bushes working together. I was always told at the time that Bush had basically fallen down on the election so Clinton could get in. Now they call him another son. That's basically been admitted. Now we're back to more Clinton and Bush dynasties.
Well, let me say, Alex, the story of what they tried to do to Reagan when they realized he was going to be nominated is told in my new book, A Choice Not an Echo, and it's quite behind-the-scenes story. What they tried to do was to make Gerald Ford co-president. And when Dan Rather accosted me on the floor of the convention, he said, "What do you think about this, Mrs. Schlafly?" And I said, "Well, it's completely unconstitutional. You want to give the vice president control of the budget, the money, our sovereignty issues, our tax issues, and leave President Reagan with nothing but the Bureau of Indian Affairs."
Well, let's stop right there, because this is such a big deal. You're confirming what I was told when I was, a kid, and then when I've talked to high-level Republicans that were there. You were there on record on national television. You were behind the scenes. The establishment was so afraid of Reagan that they were trying to get him to agree to be a titular head and try to change the Constitution illegally inside the party. Break down exactly what happened. It's sensational.
Well, tell a story in my new edition of A Choice, Not an Echo. But they wanted to give all the real power to the vice president, who would be Gerald Ford. And the reason they wanted Gerald Ford was that he was the man who took his orders from Henry Kissinger. And they thought that would enable them to run the country even if Reagan were elected president. And that is why Reagan was pounded so heavily by them that he called George Bush at 11:25 that night, and I was there in the convention hall at 11:25, and said, "Get on over here." Bush was already in his pajamas. He had given up any hope of being on the ticket. And Reagan brought him over and introduced Bush because he was afraid he couldn't get through the night. Walter Cronkite from his skybox had already announced that Gerald Ford was going to be the co-president and have the real power.
So the elites were just struggling to get their people in, and so George Herbert Walker Bush was seen as a better person for him to choose than Gerald Ford.
Oh, yeah. Bush, sure. But the first George Bush was the choice of the establishment, no question about that, and the grassroots for Ronald Reagan. And then we had enough delegates to nominate Reagan, but the establishment, the so-called kingmakers, cooked up this deal by which they thought they could take the power away from the president and give it to a vice president they could control.
It's amazing, though. So we learned that Ronald Reagan really was anti-New World Order, anti-globalist.
Sure.
But then he gets shot, and then he goes in for treatment and comes back out. I know you were in both administrations. What can you say about what happened inside of those administrations?
Well, Reagan wasn't perfect, but he certainly was better than anybody else in sight. And he was the choice of the grassroots. And he did not turn over all his power to Ford or anybody else. And yes, he made a number of mistakes that we can discuss. But however, on balance, he was the best president we had.
You're saying, bottom line, he was a good guy that loved this country.
He did. He did.
That's a big difference from Obama, who obviously wants to destroy it.
Well, he obviously doesn't love this country. He doesn't want to think we're better than anybody else. And of course we are. That's why everybody in the world wants to come here.
Well, our ideals were better, and we certainly were exceptional. Now we're an exceptional paradox of just horrible socialist and crony capitalist, and then all the other free market folks making this country go. Why do you think the Democrats are so arrogant now and admit they're lying and admit they want to wreck the economy and saying you didn't build your business? I mean, that's a way to discredit themselves. Are they that disconnected?
Well, they have a lot of rich people, and they've always had more money than the grassroots movement.
Oh, yeah.
And I think they're doing a bit of gloating, but they simply want to continue to control things. They always have. And I'm telling the people listening to this program, we beat them in 1964 when we nominated Goldwater, and we beat them in 1980 and 84 when we nominated Ronald Reagan, and we can do it again if you'll get with it. Read my book so you know the shenanigans they pulled before, and we won't let them get by with giving us another loser for president this time.
Well, Well, I've never seen the establishment this scared, and I've gone back through the history. And I want to see if you concur with that. They are really scared of the Tea Party insurrection taking over the Republicans. They are absolutely lining up against it. But I'm seeing a lot of good signs of major talk show hosts realizing that and now saying that. And what do you expect them to pull now to try to get a Chris Christie or a Jeb Bush over a Rand Paul or a Ted Cruz? What do you expect them to pull, A,